guys, what's up? Jason of New Age Revolution down here in the cave for another video, another whatever happened to video. A couple of days ago, we talked about whatever happened to WWF wrestling. Then we talked about whatever happened to Saturday night's main event. And if you've been watching the channel for long, you'll know that I am mainly a WWF guy during childhood. But I wouldn't even say the word mainly. I would say I was a WWF guy. But I was also a big NWA Championship Wrestling TBS 605 guy as well. The forgotten organization, right? The opposite of the WWF, the opposite of the bright lights, the characters, the superheroes of the WWF. So let's relive it all today. Whatever happened to NWA wrestling? All right, that's right. Like I said, the WWF was my first love when it came to wrestling and exposed me to the world of professional wrestling and the action figures that you see behind me. But by no means was it the only thing I watched. And this channel has really never given any love to the NWA, the National Wrestling Alliance, the oldest at the time and into the 90s, the oldest wrestling organization in the world was the NWA. And I loved it. It was such a different feel than the WWF. In fact, the number one thing I noticed most about the NWA was the TBS studios that they wrestled out of. I love studio wrestling. I think it's such a classic. It's such a classic wrestling feel, is studio wrestling, and the NWA stuck with studio wrestling on their most popular national show. TBS was a national channel. Yes, it was obviously housed in Atlanta, but TBS, once cable hit, homes, TBS was nationwide. So the NWA's nationwide show, while everything else is modernizing around them, the NWA's nationwide show stayed in a tiny little television studio until 1989. Which is amazing, to think about, that they stuck with that format for so long. And what a format it was. Some of my best wrestling memories are tuning in to TBS at 6:05 on a Saturday night. And the deal with TBS was that for some reason everything was on the fives, right? So and I think it's because at that time TBS had, I think, news breaks. And so at 6 or sometimes on the hour, they would do a 5-minute news break, from what I remember. And I think they would also do a 5-minute sports break. Like they would give sports scores, college football scores. And so I think that because of that 5-minute break thrown in throughout the day, shows started on the fives, which was weird, but it was TBS's thing. Like that's how you knew that, that was TBS's calling card, was that it was on the fives. And so World Championship Wrestling, not WCW, see, WCW took over or renamed NWA, but NWA's Saturday night 6:05 show was called World Championship Wrestling, WCW. And it was from those Techwood Drive studios in Atlanta and aired on TBS. And again, the feeling is so great with Tony Schiavone, a very young Tony Schiavone, and a very animated anchor, co-commentator named David Crockett, brother of the owner or promoter of NWA, Jim Crockett. So he gives little brother a job commentating And David Crockett is the most excited, over-the-top commentator ever. But not in a bad way. I loved David Crockett. You've heard me talk about the Philadelphia Spectrum's Cal Rudman and how much I can't stand him. And how he would almost like go out of his way to just kill kayfabe. David Crockett went out of his way to pump kayfabe up even more than the show was trying to do. David Crockett was just a kid. He was almost like a little kid doing commentary, watching all of his favorite wrestlers perform. Great stuff. Great stuff. So many great angles. And this was a 2-hour show. So aside from primetime wrestling, we didn't get a 2-hour show at all. We got a house show made. Sorry, battery update there. Anyway, like I was saying, we didn't get a lot of 2-hour wrestling. WWF would give us primetime, and primetime was a 2-hour show. And that's it. The occasional house show that we would catch would be almost 3 hours. But weekly wrestling was an hour. And weekly wrestling was mainly squash matches. Well, the NWA Championship Wrestling, World Championship Wrestling show on TBS was 2 hours. And it was full of matches and storyline advancing interviews. And all of the interviews were at the podium, which was about 15 feet from the ring. And the dressing room was actually, the back offices of the Techwood Drive studio. And the arena was separated from the offices by a curtain. And the curtain was about 5 feet from the ring. So there was no walkway, there was no aisleway, there was no slapping, fans as you came down the aisle. Oh, no. It was so intimate, so small, so great. It fit, I would guess 75 fans, maybe. And on only 3 sides of the ring. No, probably like 2 sides of the ring were fans. I mean, it was just so tiny and so great. And but even though it had that tiny little studio, huge angles happened on NWA Championship Wrestling because it was really their main show. And so you had main event matches, you had title changes, you had feuds start, you had good guys turn bad, bad guys turn good. You had it all right there. And the magic would happen in the interviews because the big matches would get established right there at that podium. And oftentimes guys would come out to confront, I can't tell you how many times Dusty Rhodes confronted Ric Flair. Some huge angles where Magnum TA, slapped Ric Flair and Sting, came out to confront Flair at one time. And Michael P.S. Hayes challenged Ric Flair and Manny Fernandez and Rick Rude, establishing their feud with the Rock and Roll Express. I mean, it was so great. It was so great. And the in-ring action, even as a little kid, I could tell that the in-ring action was a lot different than the WWF. And I want to say better. I want to say that the in-ring action was better. I got exposed to a little bit more wrestling, versus superhero power moves and things like that. But so good. I mean, God, I can think of, guys that came on that show. Abdullah the Butcher was on the WCW show. Magnum TA would win every match in like 10 seconds with a belly-to-belly suplex. They were really pushing him huge. Nikita Koloff was just all over that show. The Rock and Roll Express were on every week. And then guys would come in, so you'd see Buddy Landell, you'd see Terry Taylor. Rick Rude would come in. You'd see Black Bart. You saw the formation of the Four Horsemen. It was just legendary. It was great action. It was so great. And that the NWA picked up a little bit of steam. And around WrestleMania, well, first of all, before we get into that, the NWA pay-per-views weren't available in my area. I did not have them on the Greater Rochester Cablevision pay-per-view company, whatever it was called. And I've read later on that Vince McMahon would threaten some of the cable companies and into not airing the NWA pay-per-views. And so, I never saw a Starrcade until way later. I never saw a Great American Bash, but that was their pay-per-views. And WCW Saturday Night would also, or NWA Saturday Night would also show, little clips from those shows, so you could see some of the action. But in 1988, as WrestleMania 4 was going off, the NWA released its first pay-per-view quality show and gave it away for free on TBS called Clash of the Champions. And that first Clash of the Champions had Ric Flair and Sting going to a 45-minute draw. And it was outstanding. It was just great, non-theatrical, awesome wrestling. And it was really fun to watch. And that's how I became a Ric Flair fan, was seeing him come out every week and stand at the podium and cut the greatest promos ever. And then when the Four Horsemen got started, you had Arn and Ole and Tully Blanchard and J.J. Dillon standing right there with him, usually holding all the belts, and the best. Just a totally different feel from the WWF, but also so exciting. And that Saturday 6:05 TBS time slot is just a beautiful time. It's a great time. Lots and lots of memories sitting in front of the TV. Learning all these other guys, all these non-superhero, non-cartoony style wrestlers. I was learning all those guys Saturdays at 6:05. And then it grew. Like I said, then, around 89, 90, NWA started, just busting out the pay-per-views like crazy. And, I think keeping up with the WWF. And I would swing back and forth. I really liked the purity of the NWA. I liked the wrestling of the NWA, and I started shifting from WWF to NWA around 90, 91, 92, when Dustin Rhodes and Ricky Steamboat, and again, Rick Rude, and Steve Austin and Brian Pillman, and all those guys were hanging out in the NWA. Loved it. And then, of course, it morphed into, Monday Nitro and WCW and all the, the rest is history. But it all began from a little studio on Techwood Drive in Atlanta, and a crowd of 50 just enjoying Dusty Rhodes and Ric Flair and all those guys. It was amazing. Eventually around 89, 90, I believe, we finally got action figures for the NWA. And as a kid, I was always waiting for them. I was always hoping for that Dusty Rhodes or that Ric Flair wrestling figure. But NWA in the early years had really nothing to do with marketing to kids. They had T-shirts. I don't even know how you'd get them. I assume at the shows, because they never really advertised a merchandise catalog or anything like that. You're certainly not going on their website and finding the stuff. And so, wrestling figures were never happened until the LJN line ended and the Hasbro started, and then Galoob jumped in with, and at that point, I believe, like Ted Turner was getting involved, and we were starting to see more of the commercialization of WCW, and the Nitro was a few years away, and so it jumped in and obviously did what it was supposed to do, and we got my second favorite wrestling figure line. We got the Galoobs, and it was great. And that's kind of the wrestling that I ended up watching until I stopped watching. I mean, the last stuff I watched regularly was definitely WCW into the late 97, 98 was when I stopped, caring at all. But I have all that footage. I have NWA from 84 to the close of Nitro. And I gave a lot of it away because it took me about 5 years to watch through all of it. And when I watched through all of it, I wasn't going to watch it again because, Nitro towards the end and Thunder towards the end were just horrible. So hard to watch. But I would still watch the NWA, from 84 to about 88. I would still watch that studio wrestling. And I still have some of those. I have a ton of it. So maybe one day on a Wrestling with the Past episode, we'll bust out a NWA Saturday night and talk about that. But there's so many matches and so many interviews that would take me forever to sit down and talk to you. So, what about you guys? What were you? Were you NWA guys? If were you WWF guys only? Did you give any other wrestling a chance? And if you were NWA fans, how come? Why did you? There was such a significant difference. What drew you to that difference? Was it the small studio? That was it for me. Was it the different kind of wrestling, the less superhero characters? Why did you prefer Ric Flair and Magnum TA over Nikolai Volkov and Hillbilly Jim? Leave the thoughts below, and we'll get back at it another day. Tomorrow we'll have another thing to talk about. I haven't forgotten all of our other shows that we have to do. Wrestling with the Past, and we got to finish. We got to go into the second round of PACW. I'm just having so much fun with these daily whatever happened to. So we'll slide in some other stuff. And until then, this is Tony Schiavone and David Crockett saying good night now.